Hello everyone, my name is Juven Villacastin and I will be presenting a conceptual paper entitled Distinguishing Rhetorics of Fear, Conceptual and Practical Implications in Distinguishing Fear Appeals from Medical versus Militaristic COVID-19 Rhetorics in the Philippines. So first of all, what are fear appeals? In health risk communication, fear appeals are persuasive messages with two distinct components. First, a threat component depicting a relevant threat that arouses fear. Like for example, showing a picture of a patient suffering from severe COVID-19 symptoms. And this is followed by an efficacy component that aims to persuade people to adopt feasible recommended behaviors that deter such threat. Like for example, to avoid this, you have to wear your face masks. So in short, fear appeals scare audiences so that they act in a certain way. And such a strategy has been used in communicating about health risks, such as COVID-19. However, are all fear appeals used in COVID-19 rhetorics the same? So for example, I have two fear appeals in the slide, and both have the same threat and recommended behavior, which is to stay at home. But in the lens of rhetoric, there are nuances beyond threat and efficacy that Witty's definition cannot detect. Like, for example, what is the rhetoric's view of the audience? Does the rhetoric view the audience as people who need to be educated or as stubborn quarantine violators or potential quarantine violators that need to be punished? What is the rhetoric's view of the pandemic? Is the pandemic viewed as a medical issue or as a security issue? What are the motivations for the choice of form? For example, why would you use a coffin when you can just use a PSA or do a health ad? And finally, what are the implications of using certain fear appeal strategies? So this leads us to the different rhetorical problems, objectives, and methods I use for this paper. So our first problem here is how should fear appeals be conceptualized beyond threat and efficacy to distinguish their exigencies, strategies, and forms? So this leads us to the first objective, which is to conceptualize fear appeals as diverse strategic utterances situated in political and ethical contexts, thus being distinguishable in exigency or motivation, strategy, and form. And to do this, I did a close reading and general review of Aristotle's theory of fear appeals from Technes Rhetoricus, Ethica Nicomacheia, and Politica. But this leads us to another problem. If fear appeals are situated, then what are the specific COVID-19 contexts and narratives that influence the use of certain fear appeal strategies? So this leads us to the second objective, which is to describe the different pandemic responses in the Philippines and how they create different rhetorical situations that enable different rhetorics of fear. And to do this, I did a situational criticism by triangulating official, journalistic, and scholarly sources to identify examples of Philippine contexts where fear appeals were used. And in that situational criticism, I identified two different rhetorics of fear, those that are rational in nature and those that tend to be more coercive in nature. And that leads us to the last problem in this paper. What are the distinctions between rational versus coercive fear appeal strategies? And that leads us to the last objective, which is to distinguish these differences. And to do that, I did generic criticism by distinguishing the rhetoric audience relationship, the content, the logic of the imminent threat, the forms, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I did in this paper was to do a close reading of Aristotle's theory of fear appeals. And the key takeaway here is that fear appeal strategies are influenced by ethical and political considerations or the lack thereof. So let's start with um, Aristotle's idea of fear appeals as strategies. In his Rhetoric or Technes Rhetorica, uh, Aristotle wrote that fear appeals work when the image of a threat is made to appear imminent. So there are many strategies that are used to shape this image of a threat. However, for fear appeals to work, audiences have to be given hope to deter that said threat. So it's more of a balancing act for the rhetor to balance the threat part and the hope part. Now, this is grounded in Aristotle's ethical philosophy, most specifically in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about courage as a virtue to deter fear. So it also follows that rational fear appeals should aim to instill courage to deter the threat that it is presenting. Now, where are fear appeals used? In Aristotle's Politica or Politics, fear appeals help in preserving the polity by moving them to be vigilant in protecting themselves against an imminent threat. Now, you may have noticed that I wrote here or lack thereof because there are specific examples and contexts in Philippine discourses where fear appeals don't aim to instill courage or aim to make the polity or community vigilant because these fear appeals aim to intimidate certain Filipino communities to acquiesce to the administration's more draconian efforts towards curbing the pandemic. So, what are these specific contexts? So this leads us to the next part of this paper, which is the situational criticism. And the key takeaway here is that although we are dealing with the same pandemic, there are different views or rhetorical situations of the pandemic, thus leading to different rhetorics. And in the literature review, um, most scholars identified two rhetorical situations: a medical response and a militaristic response. So let's start with the more obvious one. The medical response looks at the COVID-19 pandemic as a health issue and a health threat to a risk society. Thus, the exigency that arises from here is the need to persuade people at risk to adopt health practices to avoid COVID-19. Thus, it follows that the fear appeals that arise from these exigencies or motivations to communicate are more rational in nature because it aims to influence health attitudes and behaviors. But once again, although same pandemic, there are different views of the pandemic. And this leads us to the militaristic response, characterized by the Duterte administration's more draconian approach to curbing the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this response, in this situation, COVID-19 is framed as a security issue, which is exacerbated by the pasaway. So who are the pasaway? The general COVID quarantine violator, those protesters, critics against the government, and everyone in between. So they are treated as security threats that need to be disciplined. Thus, the exigency here is the need to control, intimidate, or punish the pasaway to control the pandemic. Thus, the fear appeals that arise from these exigencies tend to be more coercive in nature because it aims to discipline and warn the pasaway. Now that we have distinguished rational and coercive fear appeals, we need to distinguish what makes fear appeals rational and coercive in the first place. So, in my generic criticism, I identified 4 points of distinction. First is the nature of the rhetor audience relationship. In rational fear appeals, it tends to be more technocratic and non hostile in nature. For example, think of medical experts educating people at risk. Now, this is in stark contrast with coercive fear appeals because it's more punitive and hostile in nature. Think PNP warning potential quarantine violators, or Duterte intimidating protesters and critics. Another point of distinction is the imminent threat in the fear appeal to arouse fear. So, how do rational fear appeals arouse fear? By portraying COVID-19 as a threat. While in coercive fear appeals, it's not COVID-19. They portray the prospect of being imprisoned or dying because of not following the government. For example, in Duterte, no vaccine, I will have you arrested, or shoot quarantine violators dead. Okay. Another point of distinction is the logic of argumentation. In rational fear appeals, they try to explain the cause and effect part of following a recommended behavior. For example, if you don't practice recommended health behaviors, then you are at more risk in contracting COVID-19. Now, in coercive fear appeals, the logic is more either or. For example, either you comply with us or you get imprisoned or get killed. Finally, where do these fear appeals appear in the discourses? Rational appeals usually appear in social marketing ads, health communication materials, medical advice, and so on and so forth, while coercive fear appeals have appeared in Duterte's presidential speeches, putting coffins in checkpoints, and even live streaming of quarantine violators being punished on social media. So, what are the conceptual and practical implications of this distinction? First, not all fear appeals are the same. Thus, each strategy is subject to different practical and ethical implications. So you can't just make a general critique of peer appeals in general. You have to look at specific strategies. However, though the differences between peer appeals are not black and white, some may share both racial and coercive traits, and maybe this can be another direction for future research. However, the differences show a clear distinction between which strategies are more ethically problematic. Coercive peer appeals, for example, are more prone to unintended negative effects and human rights violations. And that is all. Thank you.